Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon. Today we're going to talk about halftones and how they apply to clothing, fabric, folds, and wrinkles, and these types of things. I'm going to begin by looking at a couple examples of some masterworks, and then we'll do a quick demonstration.
And before we begin, if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to my free Insiders Club. Insiders Club members get first access to these weekly live streams, and you also get access to other live events, and you get discounts on courses and programs, along with access to free lessons and other free content available only to subscribers. So all you have to do is go to www.drawwithchris.com, and there you can enter your email and you'll be good to go.
So here we have Andrew Loomis and some beautiful little charcoals here. And this kind of demonstrates both the figure and the fabric together. It's exactly what we want. Now, there's slightly different treatments to fabric in terms of halftones and value relative to the figure. One, because it's a different material, and two, because it's a man-made material. So fabric has some interesting properties that organic things like figures and faces don't. One of them is obviously the ability to go quite straight and quite hard and rigid. So let's take a look at this example here. And you'll also notice that in fabric, just like the figure, we must account for the light. So we'll use gradations in the same way that we use gradations to create realistic halftones in the figure. But we also have to account for plane changes. Now, also the figure has plane changes, of course, or secondary plane changes, but in fabric they are quite harder and more dramatic and more obvious because of the nature of the material. It's different. It can get quite hard. The edges can get quite hard. If we just look at the figure here, you can clearly see, like on the hip and the rib cage here, you can clearly see that that's the highlight or the big bright spot on the figure. Then you could see the beautiful halftones. As you go this way, you can see the halftones get a little lighter. And as you go this way, the halftones get a little lighter. So there's a gradation happening. And of course, it's vice versa, darker to light, lighter to dark. Because the figure is, of course, we know is a cylinder. And it's also an egg, right? So if the highlights here, then we know we need gradations that go this way, right? So the same exact thing. Look at the cylinder, highlight on the leg, and you see how gradations go this way, dark to light, light to dark, right? That's gradation to create the illusion of a cylindrical form or the leg. So we have gradations of the figure that we know. Now, if we look at the fabric, look at this zone and this zone, you can see exactly the same thing happening, just like the figure. So Loomis put a gradation here as well. So there's gradation on this part of the fabric. See, it's lighter here, darker, 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 darker. And same thing here, lighter here, darker, 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 darker. So that's a gradation of halftone to suggest the light, describe the light. So that helps us to get realism there. Actually, here, this also, notice this zone right here. Notice as the arm is towards the light, this is a halftone, but notice as the arm is towards the light, it's a little bit lighter. And as the arm is towards the hand and raised to the light, it's a little bit lighter. And as we get to the bicep, you see how it's a little bit darker. So there's a gradation that's happening right here on this arm. So that's very important to see right there. And there's also subtle gradation of plane change. It's not so obvious here. We'll look at another example. But you can see on the fabric here, you can see right here, see this little section? You see how that's brighter than the shadow. So this is shadow, this is halftone, and this is light. You see? You see the subtle right here? This is light right there, and then there's a gradation. well, not a gradation, but a more of a plain definition. It's a sharper turn. So it's really a sharp plane. You see, that is one of the unique things in fabric. The figure can do that in dramatic light and in some bony areas, for example, the wrist, your forearm, the knee, your jawbone, the very sharp bony areas, but for the most part, no. We don't get this kind of sharpness, but fabric, of course, can because it's a different material and it's man-made. Here we have an example by the great Lion Decker, in my opinion, one of the greatest fabric artists to ever live, at least greatest American to ever live. And my God, look at the glorious, chiseled, plain definition that he's famous for. And this has an example of halftones in the figure, and even the horse. The horse is an organic thing, so it kind of counts as a figure, even though fur is a different material than a human being. But let's just pretend that a bald horse or less hairy horse or has finer hair. On the left is the original. On the right, I turned down the saturation so we can focus on the value and also so we can see more of the shapes, the value shapes. So I just quickly did this filter in Photoshop just so we can analyze it. And you could see, starting with the figure, you can see the beautiful halftones. Starting with the horse's belly, let's look at the horse body itself. This zone right here, you can see the horse. You can see the beautiful highlight in the middle. And of course, you can see the gradation as he controls the halftones using the gradation technique to create a form and light. Of course, we're talking about the egg-like form. It's quite an exaggerated egg if you think about it. Even here, this little section of hip muscle, I don't know what it's called, but you can see how there's highlight here and then more darker halftones as it turns away. You see that? So halftones here, but a bit more dramatic. So that's an example there. Let's zoom in real quick here. Okay, so we're a little bit zoomed in here. Let's take a look at the fabric of the rider, his white pants. Now you can see the clear difference in halftones as fabric definition. So in this case, this is on the horse, back to the horse. This is halftone using gradation technique to describe light and form, round form. This is halftone to describe shadow and plane definition. You see, this is a halftone, this is light, and you see that very sharp corner. So what that is, it's a plane. It's a shadow plane of a light object. So that's why it's not as dark as, let's say, the shadow plane of the horse. If we go to the horse down here, notice the shadow plane of the horse on the horse's belly. It's quite dark right there. And there's a halftone again there. But here on the rider, not so much. Going back to the rider's pants, you can see the smaller, look at these beautiful small shapes, halftone shapes right there. Even the rider's shirt. Well, let's look at the rider's shirt and the shirt of the man behind him. That's all fabric. And you could see, looking at the shirts of the two riders, you can see the beautiful halftone shape there and the corner there. So that creates a halftone shape here, right here on the rider's body. And then there's a light shape here. Then there's a corner, right there. You see? Light shape, halftone shape, sharp turn. So it's a halftone describing a sharp plane, but it works because it's fabric. And same on the arm of the man here, the rider in the back. Look at the arm. You see the beautiful halftone shape, and a slight in the light shape, it's even a little bit of highlight right there. Then you see light, boom, turn the corner using halftone to create plane change in fabric. So just an example that fabric has that capability. We can do sharper turns with fabric just by simply using halftone shapes. And that helps us to create more realistic fabric. So let's do a demonstration and apply what we just learned here. Okay, we have a little demonstration here with just a male figure wearing casual clothes. and beautiful sunlight, looks like. We can see the beautiful halftone shapes. What I'm going to do is analyze the light, and it's clearly from up and to the left. You can tell by his ear. So if we look at the man's ear, you can see the cast shadow of the ear. Also, his arm is casting a shadow. So that tells us the light is clearly upper left. It's probably the sun. Almost 100% sure this photo is taken outdoors. So what I'm going to do is just put a nice little wash of little halftone. Use a little airbrush here. Just put a nice gradient wash from the bottom up. My little rendering started. I could also do, because I'm working on tone paper, I can do light down. Let's do that now. I'll just do a quick gradient wash. Light coming from the up to the down, and then from slightly left to the right. Just basically kind of set myself up a little bit with a bit of tone. Just give me a nice little bit of tone to kind of get you in the mood. All right. I got my little wash here. I'm just going to block in the shadow shapes that I see. And this may include halftone shapes. So right now, I'm just kind of focusing on what's clearly dark, clearly should be in shadow. So there's a lot of things that are clearly dark. Now, a lot of these will end up being halftones in the value scheme. Which means that relative to the values that I'm going to use to complete this, some of these tones may be in the halftone range. So, for example, the shadows I just kind of locked in on his shirt are much brighter than the shadow on his pants or on his belt. So his belt is very dark, local color. Shadow under his arm that's on his pants is much darker than the shadow of his shirt, the shadow on his arm, upper arm, for example. So I'm considering, as I do this, I'm considering my value structure, meaning, okay, what has to be light, what has to be dark, everything else must be in between. Be in between for me. I'm going to go ahead and block in his shoes. His shoes have a very dark local color. I really like outdoor photography with the sun. It's so pretty. I'd like to take more of it. It's like a big, beautiful spotlight. Of course, it's very harsh too, so it can those flattering lights. Some of your models may look a bit strange. And he has some nice halftones in his hair. I'd like to get that, establish overall value pattern first before I something like that. But some of them are 50-50 values, meaning they could either be grouped with the light or the shadow. Some of them are local color, so he has patches of darker gray hair than patches of lighter gray hair, so the local value matters there. This little photo's been sitting in my reference folder for years now. I've been wanting to draw this character for a long time. The light is so gorgeous. Take more photographs. All right, got a nice little block in here. Okay, now what I want to do is kind of darken the shadow, but I'm going to use gradation here just to add a bit of realism and to make things quicker. So this is a wonderful technique. So I have the shape blocked in, and of course this works well in Photoshop or any digital software where you can do a mask. Right now I'm having put on a mask so that it's kind of tight, but you can see I'm basically taking an airbrush or just making a gradient. So airbrush is a nice tool for that. Oh, I forgot to block in his pants. And then I'm kind of going through what's dark right now. So, for example, the dark area under the cast shadow of his arm, casting a shadow on the belt and on his pants right here. The cast shadow of his arm, casting a shadow on his belt and pants right here. You see that? His arm where the watch is right here. You see how dark that area is? So I want to put a gradation there because it's darker there than it is in a lot of other areas. So it's actually quite dark. His pants, the cast shadow on the inside of his pants, look at the reference here. The cast shadow on the inside of his pants is darker than the cast shadow on the top of his pants. You see that difference? Now, instead of trying to copy what we see, I'm just going to put a gradation, and then you, the viewer, will make the realism for me. You see, just put a little gradation. As long as you have the logic, and my logic is okay, that little bit of pants receives less light than the top, of course, because the top is getting some of the global ambient light. Look at this wrinkle under the shadow of his foot. Look at his right foot right here on the reference. His right foot. Look at that little shadow shape right here. That is a hard cast shadow on top of a dark object, his pants. So you see how dark that is. So that's going to be darker as well. So I'm just kind of putting in a little wash of halftone, dark gradients into my shadow shape, and they're creating dark halftones. That's essentially what I'm doing. Okay, now what I'm going to do is put in a light gradient. So we know the sun is from the upper left, so I'm going to exaggerate the light gradient now. I'm really going to kind of hit it hard because I kind of know how dark I'm going to go. And so that's on the pants. We'll put a little highlight on that little wrinkle in his pants there. Pants will get a dark gradient. You'll see. It'll feel. Actually, I'm going to erase that. What I'm doing is I'm about to establish my lightest light. So once I know how light I can go and how dark I can go, then the halftones will be much, much easier. So now I'm going to block in the value of the pants and the shoes. Okay, so the pants are much darker than the shirt and the skin, obviously. So I need to block that in. how dark I can go. So I need this to be its full darkness. That way the shadows will be their full darkness. And I'm gonna even use a gradation here. You see the pants, let's say his butt, right? The pants at his butt is has a gradation from the bottom to the top. Pants from the front leg here, from the right to the left, there's a subtle gradation, even though it's more of a planar plane change. It's more of a boxy plane change. And from the bottom, there's some gradation happening there. At the heel of the back leg, there's gradation happening from the bottom, the inside, that wrinkle there. So I'm just putting some areas that kind of need a little gradation, little bit of lightness or darkness, excuse me. Need to go darker in value, really, that's all it is. Okay, so the shoes are in the shadow layer. Forgot his watch, actually. And a little bit of his skin, too. There's a gradation on his elbow. His forearm, as he gets into the light, of course, subtle gradation there. In his face, there's a gradation, which are transition tones. So these halftones are transition tones, and then the hair has some little dark gray patches. You see already, just by putting halftones, we got pretty far with realism. We block in the darkest dark and lightest light now. Okay, I'm going to block in the lightest light that I see, and that's a little too bright, I think. So I know it's there and on the shirt. And I'm going to use kind of a blocky technique, sort of like what we saw with Leyendecker, which kind of gives me feeling of harder edges, which gives me a feeling of the material that I want, which is fabric, of course. So no gradation here, just blocking in, really. Taking a blocky, literally using a blocky brush to literally block in. Just kind of blocking in little patches that I see are pretty light. Probably of these, the collar or his shoulder will be the brightest. I have to decide that pretty soon. Skin has a little bit of rim and little parts of his knuckle. And little touches of hair shape. Now, the hair will make sense when I use texture, but right now it doesn't quite feel like hair. Okay, that looks pretty good right there. Let me block in the darkest dark. Oh boy, it has to be, well, it doesn't have to be his arm. I can make it, actually, I want to make it the armpit. I want to make it the armpit because I want you to look at as close to his face as possible. So I'm going to put a little dark inside of his ear, just a touch inside the armpit, because really the darkest dark is at the belt. The belt is the darkest local colored thing. I kind of don't want you to look there too much. I don't want contrast there, so I'm making a design choice now. It's important, we have to edit a lot. Sometimes the photo doesn't give us exactly what we want, how we want our drawing to look or our painting to look. And right here, that is kind of pants. Really need to darken his shoes. The cast shadow on his shoes, where the pants cast a shadow on his shoes. Actually, his shoes is quite dark. Okay, I got my darkest dark, my lightest light, my shadow shape, my local values established, and I got sort of the beginning of my first halftone gradient, which is the basically the fall off as light gets further away from the top where the light source is. Things get a little darker. So now I'm going to go in and start to chisel, and let's just focus on the arm area for now. See if we can see how we can play with halftones to get some realism here. So I'm going to zoom in here. So I got my pretty much all the colors I need or the values that I need on the thing. I'm gonna color pick as I go. Right now, I'm reinforcing the core shadow on this fabric and also adjusting some of the shape a little bit. Let's see. Differences. Here's one that's very interesting. So if we look at this shape here, pay attention to this zone right here, his arm and his back, and specifically the fabric on his arm. That's what I'm going to render now. And especially that little small shape right here, there's a nice halftone inside and a nice gradation. It actually gets brighter as it turns here. So I'm going to put a little gradation in this shape here. And then it gets darker as it goes to the right, left, excuse me. So that's really pretty. And then this small wrinkle shape right here, same thing, gets a little bit darker there and then a little bit lighter as we go to the top. So gradation there and a bunch of little small shapes I don't want to render, but we can kind of see as we get to the elbow, cast shadow. Actually, shadow. His little arm as shadow. And as the shadow gets, there's a gradation. So as it turns into a halftone shape. And then as his arm, there's some nice gradation. So let's do that. As his arm goes inward, there's a cylindrical gradation, creating the halftones that we need in his arm. So we already know about this technique. And also, there's a little egg. There's a little egg on his arm, forearm, because he has quite a meaty forearm. He doesn't look like he works out, but he's got some thickness to that forearm. Contour with some tone. See that arm is starting to turn and it's starting to come off the canvas. This is exactly what I want. Some of these wrinkles are starting to feel like that realistic wrinkles still need more refinement, a lot more refinement actually. We're getting somewhere. We're getting somewhere. Finally, let's do this shape. I think it's a good stopping point here. Little shape close to his elbow on the fabric now. Back to the fabric on his elbow. Has some nice gradations. As it gets inward, and then there's a sort of a top plane that's receiving bounce light. It gets a little bit brighter. So that is a gradation and halftone combination. Oh, that is to a gradation applied to a halftone shape. Well, in this case, it's more of a shadow shape, but it's working really nicely. And then you can see this light shape creating a interesting, then a subtle gradation of light as I go up, and it creates the illusion. You see, I took this light shape here, right here on the drawing, this light shape here. I put a gradation up. You see how that creates the illusion of realistic form. I'm going to do it the opposite way now. Light from the shoulder goes inward. Light from the collar, there's a gradation as the light from the collar goes from his neck towards the tip of the collar, you see? And we do the other way. You see how just that simple gradation, which is a light half tone applied with gradation technique, creates a realistic collar. And then here, this top plane is not quite light, but it's a lighter halftone right there. And then you see with that chiseled edge and the subtle value difference, it creates an interesting plane change. Over here, the corner near his shoulder, and then another gradation at the bottom of this little triangular shape right here. Here's the little shape. You see the gradation? You see the original? You see how that this triangular shape on the original reference here, this shape right here, right here, right here, right here. You see how it's brighter here, darker here? That's because that's a plane change, and then it's another subtle plane change. So it's a gradation, two subtle plane changes, and we can communicate it with one gradation. So that's how powerful gradation is and how useful it is and how we constantly want to think about what we're doing in terms of form. Really, what I'm doing is describing form. And realism, part of realism is form description. The elbow, let's put a little bit of highlight in the elbow. I get that feeling of cylinder form, a little bit of highlight on the elbow there. Should be more subtle, so I'm just going to make it a bit more subtle. And I should use a different brush, but it's a bit more of a, whoops. So it looks like I'm copying tones, but I'm just saying, I'm just trying to describe the form on that forearm, which is it's both a cylinder and an egg, but I need a different brush. Let me get this forearm to read, and we'll talk about the shadow. I'm not happy with this forearm. I want to get it forearm. Very flat right now. I'm not happy. All right, so I got to put a little bit of meat or tone right there. A little bit of half tone. So this is light, so I'm putting a half tone here now to get that wrist to feel, the forearm to feel round. I'm going to adjust the shape a little bit. The shape isn't helping either. It doesn't feel like a forearm shape completely. drawing marks here too, just to show. I really want this forearm to read like a cylinder. Still not quite happy with it, but I have to move forward here. It's getting there. Let's do a quick halftone on the sleeve here. Notice that this wasn't reading. Now it's reading quite nicely. This area I'm brushing in right here and creating a subtle plane change with a gradation of a halftone in the shirt. And finally, let's talk about details in the shadow. So let's look at the shadow on his arm. The cast shadow of his arm on his shirt. You notice there's some detail there. Now, do we want to make some of the wrinkles lighter in the shadow? No, we want to make things darker, and we do that with halftones and gradations. So for example, there's a detail right here, and I don't want to make the shadow lighter, which would be a mistake. Definitely never want to do that. It's generally a terrible idea. And notice how I just created a shadow wrinkle, a wrinkle detail in the shadow just by making a halftone. You see that right here. Right here, you see what I just did? So look at this area right here compared to the reference. I will do before and after. Okay, before, look at this area. Before, after. You see? You see how that looks like a realistic detail, but it's not. It's just a gradation. So that's intelligent use of gradation to create detail in the shadow. So that's partly value control, partly good technique, and partly just good understanding of form and light. I know what the form is, I know what the material is, and I know why it's brighter there because you know the answer, comment below. Why is that little area brighter than the underneath? Because, of course, it's turned upwards. It's towards the light. It's turned upwards. And we can just keep going here till we get to the finish, but that's all the time we have for today. And you could see how, let's zoom out and see what we have. Okay, when we zoom out, we can see we got some pretty good realism in that area. Obviously, we just need to keep going. Notice the arm starting to feel like an arm. It's starting to feel like a round, eggy kind of form. And notice all the chiseling that's happening with the fabric and the beautiful halftones and gradients, giving us the illusion of light. And also we're able to get some detail in the shadow by simply adding more darker halftone, darker tones and gradients.